Welcome to our session. It's in the chat fam, and today we'll be discussing all things LLMs and the future of search. My name is Christine Göös. I run marketing at Crowd. We're a global media, creative, and data company. And with me, I have Tom Andel, who is the go-to person for me whenever I need to ask anything about LLMs, AI, and organic performance. Welcome to the session.
Thank you, Christine. Excited to be here.
So it's not a secret. Discover is completely changing online with LLMs, and it means that marketers also have to shift. So you're moving from search engine optimization to answer engine optimization. Talk to me a little bit what's going on.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie. It's been a whirlwind 24 months, and arguably, I would say that search and discovery has changed more in the last 2 years than it has done in the last 25, and that's as a result of the rise of AI and those assisted experiences. So. Really kind of like what's changing is, people are still very much using those traditional search experiences. And by that, I mean Google, Bing, etc. But we are seeing a shift towards, discovery in alternative platforms, large language models being one, but also, community-based discovery in platforms like Reddit. Mm-hmm. And then we've also got social searches as well on the rise. So it's becoming way more diverse than it's ever been before. And as a result of that, the way in which we begin to target those consumers, those customers, needs to change as well.
And we actually have some data around this too. So we did conduct a study with around 2,000 US consumers together with our partners at ImpactSense on how people are actually discovering and shopping across LLMs. I think one data point stood out to me where I believe it's around 23% or 1 in 5 consumers now conduct their entire shopping journey in LLMs. How is consumer behavior shifting?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, over the last 2 years, as people have moved into these experiences, right, it started off, being quite informational and research driven. But now we're seeing the technology advance in such a way that you can now look to make that end-to-end kind of like whole purchase journey happen within the large language models. So we've got OpenAI and Shopify partnerships emerging, whereby, all the way through from awareness to, conversion, that whole experience can now be served directly through the large language model. And I guess the question that we need to ask ourselves with that is, all of that activity, right, is happening away from your website. That's exciting in one sense, but daunting in the other, right? Where we as performance marketers, we need to track that performance, right? And we don't necessarily have all of the capabilities yet to track that whole interaction within those large language models. So again, lots and lots of change, and I think an exciting time for us as marketers.
And I think it's also changing how people trust brands or who they trust for recommendations, right? One of the standout stats also from the study was that now we actually have 70% of people trusting AI recommendations over celebrities or even influencers. And I think the second point to me was extremely surprising.
Yeah. It's, again, slightly daunting in the sense that, the answers that are being provided within these large language models are aggregated from lots of different sources online. But there is still an element within it where these large language models are making those decisions, finding that information. And, as you use ChatGPT, for example, it will always come back with, do you want me to do more? Do you want me to go further, etc.? There's a never-ending kind of loop to that. Mm-hmm. It's always wanting to serve, and I think we do need to be cautious with the information that we get from those models, based on all of the information that it trains itself with, how it's summarizing those answers, but how it's always wanting to, appease the initial prompt that you put in and deliver on that. So yeah, my advice: definitely don't trust everything that you see within those large language models, because there is lots and lots of hallucinations that can happen, etc. So I find it super interesting that we're seeing stats like that around the trust that people have within those models. But yeah, my message there is always err on the side of caution with that.
Speaking of trust, what was the last thing that you purchased after researching in LLMs?
Yeah, it's an interesting one actually. So I've been doing a lot of research this week on car insurance for one of our clients based in the UK. So my work there really has been to put all of these different prompts in that we think consumers will ask, and look at how those prompts change, right, from traditional search behaviors where you put cheap car insurance quotes into something like Google and it will give you that list of responses, whereas now when you engage with a platform like ChatGPT, I specify my age, I specify the car I'm driving, where I live, and it will consider all of those things in that broader context to provide a more targeted direct answer to me. So that's really, really interesting. But beyond that, beginning to kind of like reverse engineer how I think ChatGPT is calculating and providing its answer to me. So, looking at the sources that it's using to build its answer, and understanding what that means for us from kind of like a marketing and a PR perspective in order to try and influence the results that it provides.
One interesting insight that I noticed when I have been using ChatGPT, so I was asking it to help me solve a production challenge for a video that I was making for Crowd. And we had a situation where we were going to film with a Sony camera, but we needed to capture audio separately. And again, I don't necessarily have the budget to like hire a full like audio person coming in with professional equipment. And so I asked for a workaround using my iPhone and ended up buying Rode wireless lavalier mics out of that query, right? So I think it's interesting how we're now moving from like just asking like, oh, what is the best mic for X, Y, and Z? But I actually went in with a question of like, I have a problem to solve, and it led me to a product.
Yeah, absolutely. And the example that you've cited there around the traditional search behavior around best, different features, etc. It is still in some ways doing that in the background, where it does go out and it does query the open web. I found that it does look at those types of triggers on those queries. But I guess what it's doing for you here, right, is it's doing all of that in the background, so you don't have to provide you that that clear answer and direction. And I think that's the exciting change that's happening here.
Is the EEAT principles out the window, or do we still continue to build our SEO strategies based off of that, or how are they evolving?
Yeah, it's a good question. For those that aren't familiar with EEAT, they are a set of principles that Google has suggested that we as organic practitioners adhere by in order to drive more positive brand experiences and through that better results within search. Stands for experience. How well do we as a brand deliver first-hand experience of the subject that we're talking about? So think about as like customer reviews as an example, people that have used the product. Expertise. So how well do we demonstrate credibility around the topic that we're talking about? So qualifications of an individual who writes a particular piece of content that sits on the website. Authority, how well cited, how well mentioned are we on third-party sites, platforms? What's our influence there? And then those three things kind of sit around this trust element, which is how much of a trusted brand are you online? And those principles are principles that we've been focusing on for a number of years to win out in search, and they absolutely apply within this new world of the large language models as well. So if you've been focusing on those things, great, definitely continue to do that. I think my advice would be, in optimizing for Google, whilst those principles absolutely apply, where you might find a difference is, you've got a particular ranking gap in Google, and therefore you need to generate an answer through content to address that ranking gap. That might not necessarily translate into a gap that ChatGPT or the large language models see that your brand has. An example of this week, doing lots and lots of searches around car insurance, we can see that there might be a ranking gap appearing around, mistakes and how they impact your insurance premiums within traditional search. But when we're looking at ChatGPT and the large language models, they've actually identified a problem around kind of like the customer support and the experience that we offer. So to my earlier point, the broader principles absolutely apply, but do the research in both of those platforms to know tactically what are the things that you need to focus on, coming from different content types, etc.
So the different content types are actually impacting where the gap may be, because the conversations that people might have around car insurance on Reddit, for example, are completely different than what information you might find on the open web, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what happens with Reddit is people will turn to that platform to ask a question and find an answer when they haven't been able to find that answer through Google search initially. So actually, Reddit becomes a really powerful source for new content ideas that are untapped. Go into those different subreddits, go into those communities, see what questions customers are asking, audiences are asking, and then use that to inform your content strategy, because the chances are they're in Reddit talking about it, they've tried to find the answer elsewhere and haven't been able to, so they've turned to the community to find that answer. And we've had a lot of success with that tactic over the last kind of like 18 months as we've seen Reddit rise more and more within the results and the usage within LLMs.
That's definitely a plot twist I was not expecting in organic search, but here we are. Walk me through the concept of live search and advanced SEO.
So I think with this, my strap line to this is, as a brand, you need to be delivering more content in more places. So, what that means in practical terms is everything that we've just spoken about there, understanding the conversations that are happening in communities, understanding where you've got those kind of like, challenges, gaps in the large language models, Google search, those different platforms. But again, as you use these large language models, you will see that they build their answers from lots and lots of different sources. So you absolutely have to be thinking about PR and influence outside of your owned assets, right? So use that as a research source to understand what are the influential sites that are being used to build this answer. And then look at affiliations, brand partnerships, influencer partnerships, to try and form content opportunities off your owned assets through earned media. So that's kind of like a broader example, but never ever forget kind of like the technical foundations as well. An example of that is I see a lot of cases where websites have got their content built in JavaScript, for example. Now, Google has had its problems rendering and understanding content that is in that particular language. It's got better at it, but the large language models really struggle with it at the moment. That may get better, but in the here and now, if you've got your content, it's within JavaScript, there is a chance that you've got a technical problem there with the large language models trying to read and understand that. So get the tech right. Look at how you can use those sources to build out content opportunities, and then look at what sites are being used to provide those answers within the large language models, and use that as a targeting opportunity to build partnerships with those sites.
So in many ways, it looks like organic search is getting closer to brand marketing than it ever has before. And with the resurgence of digital PR, influencers, your social content, even with Instagram captions being indexed now, you really have to show up more creatively and authentically across different places. But so we know that you need those different citations to show up across LLMs. How do you increase them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll take a bit of a step back on the earlier point, because we are moving into a world as organic practitioners, right, where we need to interact with lots of different teams and stakeholders within an organization to enact positive change in large language models, traditional Google search. So, working closely with brand, editorial, PR, development teams. We need to be the connective tissue that brings all of those specialisms together in order to drive positive brand growth and performance in search. But I think in terms of kind of like building those citations, obviously you need to provide a better kind of like branded experience overall. So use all of that information that you are collecting, that your audiences are saying about your brand. And, you're not just going to address that through editorial or content changes. You have to make broader changes to your business. I mentioned, the customer support problem that we're seeing in large language models for a particular website. That isn't something that we're just going to address through content. That needs to be kind of like structural, functional changes within the business to make those changes. So I think, again, like, don't operate in a silo with a lot of this stuff. You need to rely on the specialisms of other teams to almost be the rising tide that raises all ships, right? And that's how you start to drive positive performance, where our world is now becoming a lot closer to kind of like, brand, business consultants, etc.
And even product, right? Because if you're uncovering that there's a lot of criticism over a feature or a product attribute, you can't fix that with any amount of influencer content saying that this doesn't exist or that it's better than it actually is. That's really fascinating. Another follow-up question that I have is, from my understanding, and this is, I guess, especially true for B2B, is that now with LLMs, they are looking to anchor content to trusted voices in that particular field. How is that impacting consumer marketing as a whole?
Yeah, and there's going to be a tipping point to this, right? Because the acceleration of AI generated content has exploded over the last 12 months. And we've seen a bit of a drop in the amount of human generated content that's been published as a result of that. So it's one to be cautious of, because we could end up in a world where it's just a cycle of AI generated content training the AI large language models, and then we're in a really big spin. So yes, they are still very much kind of like leaning into where they can bring in that trusted human expertise. And that tracks all the way back to, what we were saying at the start around, there's EEAT principles. If they sit at the heart of your strategy, you're gonna be in a good place. You're gonna have the right foundations to grow brand visibility.
So then, once you actually are cited, the million or billion-dollar question, I guess, is how do you track all of it? How do you measure?
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge that we're facing at the moment. Traditionally it's been very transparent, I think, with Google sending traffic to your website. Great, you can track that. You can track what happens on your website. You can track when someone purchases. That now changes, right, with consumers not necessarily needing to come to your website to find the answer. And all of that discovery is happening on platforms like ChatGPT, where, the performance element is still quite opaque in terms of like, how many prompts are being used, what type of information people are collecting. What I think is quite interesting though, and what's happened very, very recently, is that Adobe has acquired SEMrush for $1.9 billion. So it's a very, very large investment from big tech in this space, and I think that's a real statement that is being made. And I think the reason they've done that is obviously they've got the analytics capabilities, which give us the ability to track what's happening on the website through their analytics platform. But they've bought into SEMrush because SEMrush has all of this reporting around what's happening off the website. They can track different large language models, citations, how often you're mentioned, etc. They've got very, very good tracking on what's happening in traditional search as well. So I think that's a real statement from Adobe. And, a point on this question, it's still quite opaque at the moment, but we've got the attention, we've got the investment of big tech, and Adobe are trying to gain first mover advantage here by buying into an existing platform like SEMrush that does all of that offsite tracking very well. And I think that's going to be a very powerful combination when those two things come together. So we have that, but to give some practical examples, right? Traffic to your website from search, you are going to see, that start to drop off as people move into these experiences. Track how often you are mentioned within these different prompts. Track how often your website content is being used and cited within those answers. And, you can ask it questions like list the top 20 brands in a particular category, in a particular market. See if you come up, see how it's building those answers, and start to bring more of that tracking into your reporting.
Would you recommend that brands also track their competitors in a similar manner to see how they may be doing better or worse in some of those attributes?
Yeah, exactly. And, that gives you very good kind of benchmarking with regards to the wider market. It's something that we've been developing is a tool called Brand CI that does that. It tracks, how often you show up and how often you are cited versus your competitors. So you've got that benchmarking. But what it also does is it tracks what do the large language models actually understand? How do they perceive your brand? And that gives you kind of like the next step in the journey, right? So you can see this is how often I'm showing up. Then you can start to see these are the things that I need to tweak, I need to optimize, I need to focus on in order to improve that visibility. So that's something that we're kind of like, moving into. But absolutely, when you're doing this, yes, you need that benchmarking through your competitor set.
To close out, what's one low-hanging fruit in terms of your LLM visibility that you as a brand can take action on today?
Yeah. I would say, FAQ content, big thing. Mentioned it earlier on, you can go into these Reddit communities, you can understand the questions that, your audiences are asking, use that to inform your content. Look at if you've got any content in, JavaScript, look at the technical foundations of the website, start to lift it if you have into HTML. That will be more easily rendered and readable by the large language models. And then start to, play around with, different prompts, see what comes back, see what websites are being cited, and then kind of hand that off to kind of like your brand and your PR teams. Do we have existing partnerships with any of these sites? What can we do there in order to, try and get more placement mentions on those sources? So yeah, those are probably some quick wins that I would suggest people take away.
It almost feels like you need to take a look at your the state of your LLM visibility today, and then see that across your whole marketing mix and marketing strategy as a whole, not just organic, not just PR, but it's really becoming all encompassing.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it earlier. Trust. That's the key word here. Do we offer, an experience that is credible, is trusted to our customers? How do they represent us online through what they talk about? All of that information is being used to train these large language models. So Stay very, very close to how you're showing up and what they understand about your brand. And then, as I said, be that connective tissue with all of those different stakeholders to, change structurally, functionally, what needs to happen based on all of that feedback that you've collected.
Well, it remains to be seen if this video gets cited in LLMs when somebody asks about how to prep your brand for the LLM era. With that, thank you so much, Tom. This has been a really great conversation.
And thank you, Christine, too.